Okay, so thank you all for coming again tonight. I'm just going to review a little bit about what we talked about last week, and then we'll jump in to our new topic tonight. So last week we were talking about mental health in general, about what mental health is and how God gave us our thoughts and emotions and how important it is that we take care of those and pay attention to them. And we talked a little bit about some basic strategies for maintaining your mental health. So we talked about thought strategies that you can use, behavioral strategies, and then just some emotion strategies. So tonight we are going to really deep dive into thoughts and focus on those. They can have a huge effect on our mood, and they're really important to know about and be able to work with. So that's why we're going to spend a whole night on those. So also keep in mind, as we were talking tonight, these skills that we're going to look at, they're really specific skills for examining thoughts closely and seeing if they're helping us or not. But these are difficult to use sometimes, and they take a lot of practice. And I had to go to school for 8 years just to do this job and be able to talk about this effectively with you tonight. So if you're practicing and you feel like they're hard and you're having a difficult time, this is not an excuse for you to beat up on yourself. You're just going to make everything worse. So keep practicing. And if you feel like this is something that you would like some help with, definitely work with a therapist because they know so much about them and they can really help you with your specific situations in a way that we can't do tonight when we're just talking as a group. So again, just keep practicing and give yourself some grace with this. So another thing to think about is that we're not going to get to the point where you can completely control everything that comes into your mind. So we are always going to have thoughts every once in a while that are sad or that are anxiety provoking. And just because you know a lot of these strategies doesn't mean that you're never going to have those experiences or that you're never going to have any blips. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that you can get to the point that you don't ever have to deal with this. So, like, for example, with physical health, we know that there are lots of things that we can do to try to generally be physically healthy, and that really goes a long way. But every once in a while, you get a cold or you get the flu, something else that's short-lived. Or sometimes you have something that's chronic that goes wrong, like you develop asthma or diabetes, and you can't completely avoid those experiences just because you're a Christian. And it's the same thing with mental health. We're going to talk a lot about these ways that we can generally be more mentally healthy, and it's going to go a long way. But sometimes you're going to have times where you're feeling depressed or where you're feeling anxious. And some people biologically are just predisposed to dealing with this more often. And so just like you would take care of your physical health in that situation, you need to take care of your mental health, and you might need to actively participate in therapy, or you might need to take medication. Just like you would take your insulin for diabetes, your mental health is the same thing. It's not different just because it occurs within your brain and not the rest of your body. And being a Christian doesn't mean that you'll be able to control this 100%. Being a Christian does not exclude you from being a human and just the normal wear and tear that happens to us all. So moving on into the presentation, this first slide, you might remember this from last week. It's called the cognitive triangle. So it's showing how our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors are all connected to each other. So in any situation, the way that you interpret it is going to affect how you feel and what you do. And that's why we're going to talk so much about thoughts tonight, to see what you're saying to yourself and how that's changing how you're feeling. And it's also important to note that sometimes we don't recognize the things that we're saying to ourselves right away. And we feel like our emotions are going haywire for no reason, like we can't identify why we're upset about something. And that can feel really helpless, or we can judge ourselves for that thinking like, I don't have any reason to be sad. I don't know why I'm feeling this way. But there is almost always a thought connected to it that if we really practice, we can identify and realize why our emotions are moving like they are. We're not at the mercy of our emotions, and they're not just going haywire for no reason. There's always something that we can come back to. So it's a thought that you're saying to yourself, or some kind of like action or physical sensation of something that is happening that's making you feel different. So that's where we're going to work tonight. So like I was saying, these are strategies that are really good for maintaining mental health in general. But sometimes problems are going to come up in our mental health, and we really need to be aware of what some common problems are, because they will actively affect your thinking and then your mood. And again, they are just really common for almost everybody to have some of these blips every once in a while. So the main ones that I'm going to highlight here are depression and anxiety. So anxiety are the most common mental health disorders in the world. So at any given, in the last year, about 19% of people had an anxiety disorder, and throughout the course of their life, about a third of people will have an anxiety disorder. For depression, about 7% of people had a major depressive disorder within the last year. So that's really a lot of us, and we need to be understanding what that's doing to us. So for depression, it really actively changes the kinds of thoughts that you have. So that your thoughts tend to become much more negative as a whole. And you tend to look at things as being really stable and globally negative. So instead of just having a bad part of your day, you start thinking that the entire day was terrible, and that every day basically is really terrible, and everything in your life is terrible. So when you notice that you're starting to make those like global assumptions, that's a sign that you might be depressed, but it's a sign that there's probably something that's inaccurate in your thinking that's making you feel even worse. So when we're trying to treat depression, our first line of defense is that behavioral activation, like what we were talking about last week. So just doing something to get active, to get out of your room and to not be by yourself, just to get some energy up. And then we do work a lot on thoughts, like what we're going to talk about tonight. With anxiety, what you'll notice is that if you have an anxiety disorder, that you start to have like a fear of being afraid. So it's not just that a situation makes you feel uncomfortable, but you're so afraid of being afraid that you stop doing those things and going to those places that are making you uncomfortable. And that's really where you start to have a problem. So the natural tendency for anybody when they're anxious about anything is to avoid that thing or to escape from those situations that make you feel uncomfortable. And in the moment, that makes you feel better. And so then you keep doing it. But the problem is that once you avoid one thing, you say to yourself, well, that was a good thing that I didn't go there, or that I didn't do that, because I could not have handled that and it would have been terrible. And then you start avoiding more things that look sort of similar to that one. And oh, maybe not go to this other place either, because that seems uncomfortable. And so pretty soon you start avoiding more and more things, and your comfort zone starts shrinking, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller until you have like a tiny bubble of comfort and you're afraid to go anywhere or do anything. And that's just how anxiety works for everyone. So you have to push yourself. You have to push your comfort zone, make yourself do the things that feel uncomfortable to you, so that your comfort zone doesn't just continually shrink and just cave in on you. You just have to keep pushing yourself. And that comes down to thoughts a lot of the time, that we have to encourage ourselves and really make ourselves do things. Another thing that anxiety tends to do to our thoughts is to make us ruminate, where we just keep replaying scenarios in our head over and over again, and we have a hard time moving on from them. So with anxiety, we're going to do a lot of thought work, a lot of thinking about what is realistic and what is true, and making yourself approach the things that you want to avoid. And then physical relaxation can also be really helpful with anxiety. Okay, so more specifically, as we start talking about thoughts, the first level of thoughts that we're going to be addressing are called automatic thoughts. They're called automatic because they pop into your head automatically, and sometimes we don't even notice them. They're really, really fast, and they cause a shift in your emotions, and that's how you're going to notice that you probably said something to yourself. You may not be aware of thinking something in the moment, but when you notice that all of a sudden you're feeling angry or you're feeling nervous or sad, stop and say, okay, what did I just say to myself? Because there was something that you just said that is changing the way that you're feeling. So automatic thoughts are intended to be really good things. They are very helpful to us most of the time because they're so fast. They help us make quick judgments and interpretations about what's happening in the moment. That can keep us safe. That can keep conversations flowing really quickly. It has to do with like our intuition sometimes, that we listen to those, but they're not always accurate. And that's what we really need to understand, is that just because you think something does not mean that that is true. That's one of the most important things that you can understand about your thoughts. Just because you think it doesn't mean that it's connected to reality. We have to have ways to examine our thoughts and to see, is this true or not? Or is this just making me upset for no reason? So that's why we're going to be targeting them. So another thing, thoughts, they aren't magic and they aren't powerful. They only have the power that you give them. We can become afraid of them if we feel uncomfortable by them. But they're not doing anything. Thoughts are not impulses. Thoughts don't mean that you're actually going to do something because you thought it. It doesn't mean that something is going to happen because you thought, oh, what if this happens? So sometimes we especially get superstitious if we like are really angry with somebody and we're like, gosh, I just wish that like I would never have to see them again. And then something happens that's bad to them. And then we get really upset and we start being scared that like we did that or that we made something happen. But we need to separate that from our understanding of thoughts, because they are just thoughts and they do nothing and have no power unless you give them power. So one level deeper, as we're noticing our automatic thoughts, it's really helpful, I think, to write them down if you're really trying to work on some of these things and having difficulty related to your thoughts especially, so you can keep track of situations that you feel like your mood is shifting, and then write down what the situation was and what you said to yourself. And then you're going to notice for everybody that there are going to be trends in your thoughts. There's certain kinds of thoughts that you say to yourself over and over again. And they might look a little bit different if you kind of tend toward anxiety or if you tend toward depression or anger. But we all tend to fall into some of these kinds of traps repeatedly. So this slide is called thinking traps. We call them traps for a reason because they're inaccurate thinking patterns. And we keep falling into them and they lead to our negative emotions. And the more that we say these to ourselves, sometimes they can also lead to negative core beliefs about ourselves and about the world. So we need to pay attention to these, make note of the ones that sound familiar to you whenever I'm talking about them, because they're probably traps that you're falling into over and over again. So again, as you note, when you write down your thoughts or when you're just thinking about them to yourself, if you notice that they sound like a trap, then you really need to question that thought, because there's probably something that's inaccurate about it and it's making you feel worse than what reality is warranting. So one of the thinking traps that people can fall into a lot is the trap of just thinking, I can't. So it's a really global feeling of just like, I can't do this. This is too hard for me. I have no control in this situation. There's nothing I can do here. So anytime that you feel like there's just this global feeling of like helplessness, that's usually inaccurate. There's something in there that you can control or that you can do. So to defeat this trap, that's exactly what you have to do. You have to break it down and start saying, okay, maybe I can't control everything that's happening right now, but what can I do? What do I have control over? And start piecing it apart so that you don't feel so helpless. Another thinking trap that we can fall into is mind reading. This is really big for social situations. So if you have social anxiety, or you're feeling depressed when you're around other people, it's just thinking to yourself that you know what other people are thinking. And it's almost always about you and almost always you thinking that they're thinking something negative. So it's just like, gosh, I know that like they think I am so stupid, or I'm not going to go over there and talk to them because I know that like they're so annoyed with me every time I do. And you need to stop again and look for evidence. And we're going to talk about how to do that more effectively. but no one can read someone else's mind. People get confused about psychologists and think that we're psychics of some sort and we can read people's minds, but we can't, and you can't either. You don't know what other people are thinking. So if you find yourself automatically assuming that you know and then behaving accordingly, then that could be causing a problem for you. Another big thinking trap that we deal with a lot is called catastrophizing. So that's when you take a situation that might be sort of minor but negative, and you blow it up in your mind to make it really, really awful. So just thinking that whatever is going to happen is just going to be some kind of a catastrophe, basically. So if it's like something in your job and you feel like it's not going very well, then you think, well, gosh, like this is going to be the last straw and I'm going to get fired and I'm never going to be able to find another good job, or I'm not going to have enough money to support my family. And it's just making things a really big deal in your head. And of course, that makes you very anxious or very depressed. Another thinking trap that you can fall into, and actually these last two are pretty closely connected, but all or nothing thinking and discounting the positives. So all or nothing thinking is when you look at a situation and you just see it as a dichotomy. It's like, if I didn't completely succeed, then I totally failed. So if you are a musician and you make a mistake when you're playing a song, then you think, well, that was terrible. Like I messed it up and it was no good. And discounting the positive, like I said, is similar to that. That like maybe somebody said, well, I mean, it was just that one section and really overall, like you played it really well. And you think, or you say to yourself, no, like that doesn't count. Those other parts of the song were really easy. So of course anybody could get that right. But like that doesn't count because the main thing that mattered was the section where I got it wrong. So those will definitely play into your thoughts again and make you feel much worse about reality than what it actually warrants. So notice these things again whenever you're thinking about your thoughts. See if you're falling into these traps and then catch yourself. That's the main thing that you can do, because you can't fight it until you know that you're doing this to yourself. And also, if you find yourself just worrying a lot in general, we really have to be careful not to develop any positive thoughts about worrying. Sometimes we can get into these beliefs that worry is going to help us in some way, or that it's going to keep us safe and like safeguard us from bad things happening. But again, your thoughts don't make things happen. It's not going to change an outcome, and sitting and worrying about something is not going to make it go any better. Now, if there's a legitimate problem, then do some problem solving, figure out something that you need to do and take action. But if you're just sitting and worrying about it, it's not going to help anything. So like if people are worried too about like, worried I'm going to lose my job. And then you say, well, if I don't know and I don't expect it, then like I'm going to feel so stupid whenever I get fired and it's just going to be so bad. So we say like, okay, so how would you feel, if you're worrying about getting fired for a month and then you get fired? And they would say, oh, I would be devastated. And say, okay, so how would you feel if you weren't expecting it and you got fired? And they would still say devastated. So basically, if that situation happens, yes, you're going to be very upset, but what good does it do you to sit and worry about it for a month beforehand when the outcome is going to be the same, or you could have been problem solving and doing something about it? Okay, so we're going to jump in and look at some specific strategies for when you notice that a thought is making you upset and you don't know if it's warranted. So we need to use these strategies to look at reality and say, am I telling myself something that's accurate right now, or am I making myself depressed or anxious for no reason? So the first question that you need to ask yourself whenever you have an upsetting thought is, what is the evidence for or against this thought being true? And that can really help us see, like, is this realistic or not? So let's see. So for an example, if let's say that the situation is that you texted a family member and it's been 3 hours now and you haven't heard back. So there could be all kinds of things that you could say to yourself in this situation. So one example could just be that you think, well, they must be busy. And that thought probably is not going to cause you a whole lot of strong emotion. But if you think instead, oh, they must be angry at me, then that's going to cause more of a shift. And depending on whether you tend toward depression or not, you might think, they must be angry at me. What did I do? Or you might think, they must be angry at me. Gosh, they're so annoying because they get mad at everything all the time. So again, like that's going to cause you a different kind of reaction. But sometimes other people might go to, oh no, they didn't respond. What if they're dead in the ditch somewhere? And you start worrying about them a lot. So that's obviously going to make you very upset. So you need to, I would suggest getting out a piece of paper and writing down a lot of these things. So for evidence for and against, you're going to write down evidence for on one side of your paper, draw a line down the middle, and on the other side, evidence against. So we're always looking at the evidence against your thought or the evidence for that thought. So we're going to use the thought, she's dead in a ditch. So if that's your thought, because she didn't text you back, so the first thing you need to say is like, what evidence do I have that maybe she is dead in a ditch and that's the reason why she's not responding to me? So we could say maybe some evidence for is that she's usually fast to respond. So you can write that down. Maybe some other evidence is that you think that she's a pretty bad driver. And so you're a little bit concerned that maybe she was driving and that something happened. Another situation could be that you saw a wreck on the road or you heard sirens somewhere. And you don't know if, possibly that could be her. Okay, so you have some evidence for on that side. And again, none of this is hard evidence, but it's at least more evidence than what you have, like reasons why you believe this. So then on the evidence against side, you also have to think of things too. So some evidence against her being dead in the ditch. Maybe she is working today. You can write that down. Some more evidence might be that she has kids. And so maybe she's busy with them. Maybe her phone died. Or she's in an area without signal. Let's see, maybe she doesn't text and drive. And so it's just taking a while to respond to you. So as you go through your list, think of everything you can on both sides. There will be some times when you feel like you have a lot of evidence for, or times when you have a lot of evidence against. And once you make your list, you don't really feel like you need to go much further. Like, let's say the evidence against is pretty overwhelming and you're thinking, okay, like as soon as you write it down, you say like, well, maybe this is actually not something that I need to be super worried about. Other times, you might still be pretty worried. So one of the things that I think is helpful to do is to look at your thought before you even do this and say, how much do I believe this, that she is dead in the ditch? So let's say you start out at like 90%, like she is dead. You're just like super worried. And then you make this list and you say, okay, well, I'm still nervous, but maybe it's like 50-50. So you can immediately see like that it's helping you feel better. And I will note that with a lot of these situations, somebody else might look at your list and say like, okay, it's 2%. Like there's no way that she's dead. Like look at all of these things that could be going on. You're just worrying. And somebody else is always going to be more logical than you are, probably in this situation. But we can take it down a bit in terms of like how much you're believing that thought. If you're still upset by it, then we'll go on and you can do some other strategies. Also, with each individual piece of evidence, you can go through and say how strong of evidence you think that is. So maybe you only have one on evidence for or evidence against, but you think it's very compelling. So if that happens, then you know how to weigh things a little bit differently. And that's really helpful. Okay, so you get finished with your list of evidence for and against. And like I mentioned a second ago, maybe you go from believing this thought about she's dead in the ditch from 90% to 50%. That's a lot better than how you felt a few minutes ago before you did this exercise. But you still are probably pretty uncomfortable if you're believing it's a 50% chance that she might be dead. So you can go through and do some other strategies to examine your thought a little bit more closely. And you can keep going until you start feeling even better, even more better. So another one that can be really helpful is called What Would I Tell a Friend? So we are always much more logical with somebody else's problem than what we are with our own, and we give much better advice to our friends than what we give to ourselves. So if you're trying to do this exercise, you're going to basically recite to yourself all of the really specific details of your problem, and then think to yourself, okay, what would I tell a friend in this situation? So you can think of the name of one of your friends and you can say, okay, so if I was talking to my friend Kim and she said, gosh, I am really worried. I texted my cousin and she hasn't responded in like 3 hours. And I am really worried that she is just dead or that something terrible has happened to her because she would usually respond to me. And I'm just concerned that maybe she's really not that good of a driver. And I don't know what to do. So what would you say to Kim in this situation? So I feel like for me personally, if this was my situation, I might say, well, there are tons of things that could come up or like tons of reasons why she may not be texting you back right away. Maybe you should wait a little bit longer, or maybe she's at her job. And if she doesn't respond to you in a couple more hours, maybe you could call instead. But for right now, I wouldn't worry about it. And so that is also another good piece of advice that you can say to yourself. So after you've practiced telling your friend whatever advice you would give them, say, okay, how does that apply to me? And then try to say it back to yourself, give that advice to yourself. Because again, it's going to be much better advice than what you were just kind of thinking of on your own because it's your own situation. So you can practice that one a lot, in general with lots of different thoughts that are bothering you. Another one that's pretty simple is just saying to yourself, what's another way to look at this situation? So sometimes when it's our own problem, we get really focused in just on one way of seeing it, and one worrisome thought or one upsetting thought. If you just say to yourself, just make yourself come up with a different explanation for what could be going on, or how might somebody else see this? As you start listing out some possibilities, sometimes it helps your mind open up a little bit and broaden and realize that this may not be as clear cut as your brain is telling you that it is. And so one last strategy that I think is really helpful is called best, worst, or most realistic case scenario. And this is another one that I write out a lot because it's more detailed, kind of like the evidence for and against. Let's see. So one example that we could use with this exercise is if you are a student and let's say it's coming up on finals week and you're thinking to yourself, I am never going to get all of this done. And you find yourself really, really anxious or feeling really sad and just overwhelmed. You might be catastrophizing and thinking about all the terrible things that might happen because you're not going to get it done. So this is a good opportunity to use that best, worst, most realistic case scenario. So you're going to write down 3 columns this time. So you have best on one side, worst case in the middle, and then the far column is most realistic case. So the goal of this is really to provide some perspective for you. And I think it's really nice because it can also provide some humor, because the goal of doing this exercise is that we want best case scenario and worst case scenario to be ridiculous and equally ridiculous. So whenever you're doing this, I think it's easiest to start with worst case scenario because you're probably doing this exercise to begin with because that's where your mind is going. So you can just come through this worst case scenario, start at your thought. So if your thought is, I'm never going to get all of this done, then we're going to say, okay, worst case scenario, like in a world where everything that could possibly go wrong will go wrong, and it will go as wrong as it possibly could, you don't get all of these things done, and then what happens? So you could say, okay, I don't get it all done, and then I fail all of my classes, which would be terrible. And we say, okay, so in a worst case scenario world, then when everything that could possibly go wrong is still going to continue to go wrong, after you fail all of your classes, then what's going to happen? Say, okay, well then I'm not going to be able to graduate, and I won't get into college. Okay, so then we say, all right, worst case scenario, then you don't get into college, and then what terrible thing is probably going to happen to you? You can say, okay, so maybe I can't get a job, or I have a really low paying job. Let's just go with no job because it's worst case scenario. And then I become homeless and I have to live on the side of the road. And then you might join a gang because you have no other source of support and nothing else going for you in your life. And so when you kind of come to a stopping point where you're thinking, okay, well, this is pretty terrible, we can say, all right, so worst case scenario, you don't get all of your assignments done, and then you end up living on the side of the road and you join a gang. And that is pretty bad. So we can say like, okay, yeah, it makes sense that you would be pretty upset if you think that because you're not going to get all of your assignments done, that your life is going to go down this terrible path. And so usually when you're doing this, because you're trying to make it so ridiculous, it can just give a little bit of laughter and like, okay, like that is probably not going to happen. So then we'll come over and do best case scenario. And again, we want this to be equally ridiculous. So this is challenging when you're doing it by yourself sometimes, because sometimes you make best case scenario just kind of normal. But we really want it to be like perfect world, like everything is wonderful. So let's go through that one then. So if you're thinking, I'm never going to get all of these assignments done. So we'll say, okay, best case scenario in a perfect world where everything goes exactly how you could ever imagine it going wonderfully. So what is going to happen because you didn't get all of your assignments done? So we can say, okay, well, I didn't get all of my assignments done, but my teacher said that because I'm such a fantastic student, that they weren't even going to require me to do that anyway. So the teachers say like, it doesn't even matter. You can write that one down. Then in a perfect world, they probably give you straight A pluses because they love you so much anyway. And you probably don't even have to take your finals. And then in a perfect world, because everything is wonderful, after you get all of those A pluses and you don't have to take your finals, you probably will end up being your valedictorian of your class because that helped your grades so much. And then you're going to get into like your top school, and you might become like a CEO of some great company. And then let me try to think. You might be rich if that's something that sounds good to you, or you can like meet all these fabulous people and you just have a wonderful and glamorous life. So that's best case scenario. So now we can step back and say, okay, worst case scenario, you don't get all of your assignments done and you live on the side of the road and you join a gang. But best case scenario, you become a CEO of a really awesome company and you have like a fantastic life all because you didn't finish these and then you got all those A pluses. So again, both are probably not very likely to happen. So let's come back and look at most realistic case scenario. You don't turn in all of your assignments. And in reality, what is probably going to happen if that's true, if you don't turn in all of your assignments? So we say, okay, well, realistically, if I don't turn them in, it's probably going to lower my grades a bit. But if we think, am I going to fail all of my classes? No, I'm probably not going to. You might have to work a little bit harder on your finals to try to get your grades up, or see if you can do extra credit. And then you may have to do something over the summer, but maybe even not. And then next year, you're just going to start over. And it's not going to continue affecting you. You're probably about as likely to go to college as you were to begin with. Probably not going to be changing your odds of that or which schools you're going to get into. It's probably just going to end now at the end of the semester. So if you come back through and look here, I think it really helps you to make this most realistic case scenario because you've already done worst and best case. And you can see like, okay, these things are not going to happen. And maybe you've been catastrophizing in your head about how terrible it's going to be to not get everything finished. But in reality, yes, it might not be ideal, but it's not going to be the end of the world either. So this is a really helpful exercise, again, for when your brain is just going way ahead of you, thinking about all of the terrible things that might happen. So these are just some strategies that you can use to look at your thoughts more, to see if they're very realistic or if they're just making you more upset without any good reason. When you go through these, you can notice if it's helpful and if you're feeling like you believe that thought a little bit less once you've looked at them logically. And when you go through the exercise, you can come up with another thought to say back to yourself that is true and is more accurate than that initial thought that was making you so upset. So we will call this a coping thought. So if you go through like best, worst case, most realistic case scenario, and your initial thought was, I'm never going to get all of this done, then maybe you can think to yourself, okay, so, maybe I won't get it all finished, and I'll just need to work a little bit harder, but I can handle this, and it's not the end of the world. So just something back to yourself that is a little bit more logical so that when that upsetting thought pops up again, then you can remind yourself of what is true. So there are going to be some situations where you have upsetting thoughts in your life, and maybe they are true. And then you have to think, okay, so what do I do with this? Because they're not all inaccurate. So one of the most practical things to do if you have an upsetting thought, and it is true, is just to do some problem solving. So like I mentioned earlier, sitting and worrying about it and ruminating over it is not going to help anything. So if there is something to be done, sit and think about what can be done and then take action on it rather than sitting and worrying. So you can think to yourself, okay, what is the problem here? Then you can list out some possible choices of action that you could take. Whether they are good or bad, just list out everything you can think of, including the possibility of not taking any action. Then list out some consequences of each one of those choices. So good and bad, what things might happen if you chose that path. Pick one of them, see how it goes after you've taken action, and then evaluate your choice. And if you want to make a different choice in the future, then you can make it. But at least you've done something and you're trying to move forward and take action rather than just sitting and being upset. There are also going to be some thoughts that you have that are upsetting and that are true, but you really can't do anything about them. So if you, for instance, have somebody that you're really close with and they have a disease that is going to be fatal, and you're sitting and thinking about it all the time and worrying about them and feeling sad, that's a good example of something that like we can't problem solve away. So something to ask yourself is, what is the effect of sitting and thinking about this? And again, it kind of goes back to not having positive beliefs about worrying and just sitting and stewing over it. So if the effect of thinking about it is just that you feel really upset all of the time, you're in a funk and you still can't do anything about it, then we need to try to do something different. So sitting and being upset about something that can't be changed is not going to help you in this situation. It's not going to help the person who is sick. And it's just, making you upset and possibly like wasting time that you could have to spend with this person. So just ask yourself that again, whenever you find that something is upsetting and you just can't do anything about it. What is the effect of sitting and just thinking about this all day long? So a few final thoughts on other strategies that can be helpful. Some of the time, you're going to do these exercises with your thoughts, and you're going to see that realistically, your thoughts probably aren't true, that they were probably making you upset for no reason, but you still might feel upset, and you can't necessarily tell why. Like, you know, this is probably not logical, but you just still feel worried about it. We need to really be careful to not allow yourself to sit and keep worrying about it. So sometimes we get really stuck in our emotions. And just because our emotions aren't following our logic right away, we think that, like, well, maybe there's something to it. Maybe I'm missing something because I still feel upset about it. But that's emotional reasoning. And that is not a helpful thing to do. So we reason with logic and with facts and not with our emotions. And that's one of the ways that we can keep them from taking over our lives and dictating everything that we're doing. So your emotions are not facts. Just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that that is true. So like we said last week, you can have your emotions come along for the ride with you, but do not let them drive. Do not let them dictate what you do in your life because you feel a certain way. So if you're finding yourself doing that emotional reasoning and just thinking, well, I still feel upset, and so I don't know, and you're just stuck there, remind yourself of what is true, remind yourself of the logic in the situation, and then you have to just keep moving based on the logic and not based on how you feel. So if you find yourself in that situation, you can do some things to absorb your attention that's going to keep you from ruminating about your emotions or the upsetting thoughts that you're having. So to do an absorbing activity, you have to find something that will really take a lot of your attention, that it's going to make it basically impossible for you to sit and think about that while you're doing it. So like if you're an awesome crocheter, don't pick crochet because you can just sit there and keep ruminating about it while you do it. Pick something that is a little bit harder or that takes more concentration. So you could pick something that's physically difficult, like taking like a vigorous run or like exercising really hard. You could do like reading a book that's really interesting to you, or watching a movie that has a lot of action. Playing an instrument if you find that absorbing. You could talk to a friend, you could do a crossword puzzle, anything that takes attention for you, that can distract you for a little bit from your thought. And distraction is not our ultimate strategy for how to deal with thoughts. But remember, if we've already tried these things and you know what the logic is and you just need to force yourself to keep moving, then distraction can really come in handy then. Another thing that you can do is to practice mentally, like turning down the volume on upsetting thoughts. So this is something where you're going to be visualizing, but if it's a thought that just keeps coming up over and over again in your head, you can close your eyes and you can visualize like a big knob, a big volume knob in your mind, and you can turn it down. And it takes some practice to be able to do this well, just like all the other strategies that we have. But it can really be helpful. It was actually helpful for me when I was in labor with my son. You can turn down the pain. You can use this if you have chronic pain, or anything that feels upsetting for you, really. You can just mentally turn it down. So if you're going to practice this, you can start with things that are a little bit easier. So thoughts that are really just sort of mild or not very upsetting at all, and just practice mentally turning it down. And you could do this with with pain that's just like a little bit uncomfortable, and you can practice it that way. The more you practice it, the better you're going to get at it, and the more helpful it will be even when you have some really upsetting thoughts. So a couple other things that you can do that are just faith-wise. Well, you can do some positive self-talk. So that's really important, how I was saying earlier about replacing your thoughts with more realistic ones, those coping thoughts. So when you see that something is not realistic, say back a more realistic thought to yourself. But you can also just say positive things to yourself. If you're really hard on yourself and you have low self-esteem, then practice saying aloud things that you like about yourself or strengths that you have, or as Christians, you can practice saying the things that God says about us. You can find Bible verses that you think are helpful and encouraging, and you can recite those to yourself as something that's replacing the negative thoughts. So sometimes if you're just trying to get yourself to not think of something negative, it's really difficult to just stop thinking about that. But if you replace it with a different thought that is more helpful, that's easier to like correct your thought rather than to just say, don't think about that. And finally, praying obviously is one of the best things that you can do for yourself in any situation. So I think praying for peace is really helpful. Praying for help with any of these things is really good. Praying for ways to see yourself through a problem that you can't see the way, but you know that God can. So I think just reminding yourself that even when we are stumped and even when you feel like you can't control the things that are in your head or the situations that you're in, God is not stumped by the things that we are, and he's not stuck. His hands are not tied. And even if this is hard for you, he's got it. So remind yourself of that. Pray for yourself and pray for your friends and family, and just pray for mental health. So I know this is a lot of stuff. And like I said throughout, it can be difficult at first, but the more that you practice it, the better you're going to get at it. And talk with friends and family members who can help, or definitely talk with a therapist if this is something that's challenging for you and you really want to work on it. Therapists know a lot of really good resources that they can give you. They're going to have a lot of insight, and they're just going to be more objective in your situation than what you are. So it is not a weakness to go, but it's a sign that you're really focusing on taking care of yourself and the brain that God gave you. So let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for coming out.